Hi everyone, I'm Neil Oliver. Thanks for joining me again on GB News Originals. My guest today is Glenn Greenwald, American journalist and podcaster. Glenn, do you think there's a unifying sense to explain the seeming chaos around us? Or is it, on the contrary, chaos that's been unleashed by an elite that no longer feels the necessity to conceal what it's about?
I think with all complex situations, there's a lot of different factors, but certainly the second one that you identified for me is the principal driving one, which is that we obviously are a society, just speaking broadly in terms of, let's say, Western democracies, where there's a vast inequality in terms of wealth and power that's concentrated in the hands of a very small minority of people, while the rest of the society deals with varying degrees of deprivation or a sense that their survival is pretty precarious. And of course, this is not the first time in history where that's been the case. Typically, that kind of inequality is what has shaped most societies. And the tactic then becomes, because the minority, the ones to maintain the status quo because of the wealth and power it accords, has to ask themselves, well, we are a small minority. How do we prevent this vast majority living under various forms of deprivation from getting together, uniting, and realizing their plight and uprising against us, revolting against us, which of course history has shown is very plausible and has happened several times. I think the shrewdest way that elites deal with that problem historically is to just tamp a little bit down on their greed and say, okay, we have to share just enough, provide just enough to these hordes of kind of peasants in their eyes to keep them kind of satiated, like feeling like, okay, our situation is not great, but we can get along, we can get by, we can survive, and we're not willing to risk the cost of an uprising. And somehow elites along the way in the West have really lost that sense of even pretending to create an appearance that they care or are concerned at all about what the vast majorities think. And of course, the majorities of people understand that. So then the question becomes, well, then what is the alternative tactic? If you're not going to share, if you're not going to provide just enough to keep people content, how is it that you protect that kind of an scheme of inequality? And the only other real tactic is to fortify your security, fortify the measures that you have to crush the majority in the event that they decide they want to try and overhaul or overthrow the existing order. So you implement, as you called it, digital totalitarianism to watch people at all times, to control what they think and what they can hear. But then you also paramilitarize your state to make it clear that the state is so powerful, or private security forces that guard the richest and most powerful are so unleashed that the risks are far too great, no matter how extreme the deprivation is, that essentially the only two choices are accept your plight or be crushed in prison or die. And I think that that is the tactic that Western elites have embraced. And with that, all these technological tools that could either be empowering to masses or can be commandeered to be the greatest tool of coercion and repression and surveillance ever known in mankind is at the center of this battle.
With that in mind, are you surprised that it's Britain at the moment, obviously the focal point for this state push for digital ID? Britain that has traded for centuries really on its sense of equality, its sense of fairness, the freedom of its people. And yet it's Britain that seems to be leading the charge into oppressing its population with something that's already being bitterly pushed back at by the seething masses.
I'll speak here from personal experience. When I did the Snowden reporting in 2013, 2014, 2015, we ended up being involved in and doing reporting in, say, 24 countries from around the world, not just the West, but non-Western countries as well. And I would say that almost by far the greatest amount of anger and hostility and aggression from an elite class in any of those countries came from the UK, where almost the entire, not just government, but their media allies united in defense of the GCHQ, in defense of the right of the state to engage in mass surveillance with no limitations of any kind. And they became the most aggressive in terms of going after not just Edward Snowden, but the reporters with whom he was working. That was when they sent armed guards in to invade the Guardian's newsroom and force them to destroy the physical materials with which we were working. They, of course, detained and threatened under terrorism laws to imprison my partner after detaining him, my husband, for a long time. So I definitely had the personal experience, having sampled so many different countries and how they reacted, that the UK had this kind of very entrenched authoritarianism within it, where especially the elite class was kind of trained to just believe that the power of the state is unimpeachable. And I understand there's, of course, some, I don't want to overgeneralize. There's always some pushback. You're seeing that now with the reaction, say, to Keir Starmer's desire for a national ID card. But that was my experience. And I think being kind of at the center of Europe, but also then removed from Europe, being between the United States and the EU, has made the UK, especially without a constitution, and I realize the monarchy is kind of symbolic, but it's still very much there and accepted. There does seem to be almost inbred in British culture this notion that our freedoms are a lot more limited than they're perceived as being in other Western countries. And so I can't say I am not surprised to watch British police show up at people's homes and interrogate them at all hours of the night and even arrest them for what are, I wouldn't say benign social media posts, but certainly well within what ought to be reasonably protected. And like I said, the attitude towards state surveillance seems to be even more extreme.
So do you think that the proudly trumpeted sense of freedom in Britain has been illusory for a long time?
Yeah, I think a lot of national mythology in many countries is illusory. There's obviously a reason why it's important to indoctrinate your population to believe that the society into which they were born is one to which they ought to be grateful. There are massive benefits for the people who benefit most from the society, to convince the majority that it's not just a situation they ought to accept, but for which they ought to be grateful. And all of these countries that have long storied histories and kind of the ability to write history in a form of victor's justice, which is, of course, the United States and the UK coming out of World War II and kind of the post-World War framework that aligned with that ability to tell that story, is something that citizens in most countries feed on from the time that we're born. And even when the reality starts to quite transparently deviate from that mythology, it takes a while for the population to catch up, because it's so deeply embedded in our brains that this is something that we ought to believe. But I think at some point, when the situation becomes as extreme as it is now, you see the population start to realize, wait a minute, these establishments that I was taught to be loyal to and appreciative of are ones that, in fact, don't have my interest at heart at all. They lie to me constantly. They seem to be interested in everything except the lives and material well-being of myself and my family. And I think that a loss of faith and trust in these institutions, even though we've been inculcated from birth to revere them, is a major factor shaping not just Western politics, but also the backlash on the part of governments and elites to that loss of faith.
You mentioned the US and Britain as the victors in World War II, but I wonder if that, amongst much else, is among the load-bearing myths of the 20th century. The very idea that, whatever, we were the good guys and the good guys won World War II, and fascism and Nazism were chased over the hill into history, and communism was held at bay but was the new bogeyman. I wonder if that whole edifice of load-bearing myths is collapsing.
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, you can see why. I mean, World War II was arguably the most horrific event in the history of humanity, just in terms of sheer destruction and the kind of far-reaching nature of it, and the threats that it entailed, to say nothing of the genocides and the Holocaust within it. And you can certainly understand why that became the predominant story of the nations that ended up as the victors. But I think one of the things that I've come to learn more than anything else is that human beings do not thrive very well when they're convinced of their own absolute righteousness. Like kind of the humility that we're all very fallible, that we all are very susceptible to abusing whatever power we acquire is kind of fundamental to keeping a society just. And when you come off a victory that entails that level of euphoria, and, I think also, there was obviously a lot of destruction in Britain. There wasn't all that much in the United States. But you look at the Soviet Union, which we kind of are encouraged to forget the role that they played in that victory as well. You can understand why the two sides emerged with this kind of sense of dominance. Like, we've just proven that we are the country that merits the greatest amount of power. And that endured for generations. Even today, we're always encouraged to see every conflict through the eyes of World War II. Every neocon, every warmonger, every pro-war commentator in the media constantly encourages us to see everything through the prism of World War II. We're the countries that are good. We fight for freedom and democracy against the forces of evil. And again, propaganda is very effective. It can endure for a lot longer than it probably should. But at some point, when the propaganda deviates too extremely from the reality that people are seeing, that propaganda becomes increasingly ineffective. And I think the internet has played the primary role in causing populations to understand the breach between what they've been taught to believe in and the reality of what's taking place. And that is what has weakened this propagandistic framework on which Western power for so long has relied.
It's the dizzying extent and speed at which the myths are collapsing that befuddles me to some extent. Operation Paperclip that has become common parlance now about the thousands of high-ranking and lower-ranking Nazis that were picked up and lifted across the United States of America and repurposed elsewhere. The role played by people like Alan Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles. The conspiring that went on between MI5, MI6, the intelligence services of the United States of America, and the dealing that was going on between American transnational corporations and the Third Reich and the Kingdom of Ibn Saud in Saudi Arabia and the Soviet Union. The interconnectedness of all of these characters is suddenly at the forefront of what so many of us are coming to know. And it almost feels as if that revelation must be almost by design, so fast and so blatant has it been.
We're living in a time of what feels like pretty significant social change, and it makes us question things that we've even taken for granted for decades. And one of those at the moment that people are wondering about is actually money. Is the money in your bank account safe? Should you be investing elsewhere? Are we looking at a potential global crash? What will it mean for your savings? Is there a way that you could be using your money that might be outside of government control even? Well, TallyMoney is potentially one solution. So I'm delighted to say that I'm joined today by the CEO and founder of TallyMoney, Cameron Parry. What is TallyMoney?
Well, at TallyMoney, you basically get gold you can spend. So we give people an individual account in their name, everyday account. They get a sort code, an account number. They use that account just like they would pounds from their bank, but it's milligrams of gold that we brand as Tally.
Okay. Why would you do that, though? What is the benefit to the customer instead of just having a normal pound sterling account?
Gold's performance against the pound is above 11% per annum over the last 25 years on average. But we still need money in our daily lives, and we have savings. We know that it's good common sense and prudent to save up for things, not just living credit. Whether it's a holiday or a rainy day, your retirement planning, you need to have money in your life, basically, that you can rely on, that's dependable, that nobody meddles with, that nobody can weaponize against you, which is another element of government control when it's the government currency, which we could talk about another time. And it should be pretty simple and straightforward, and that's what we deliver at Tally. And really, we just want people to feel safe and happy with their money. There was a time when the bigger your bank balance, the more confident you felt. Now it's like, I need to do something with it. I can't leave it there. In Tally, you can.
Okay, brilliant. Cameron Parry from TallyMoney. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bev.
It's so interesting. When I was growing up in the 80s and then into the 90s, when I became a young adult, I considered myself quite well read. I went to college. I became very stimulated by reading dissident literature and philosophy, the kind of normal experience that you have when you're 18 and 20 and introduced to this whole new world of thought in academic institutions. Not sure that's still quite the case, but that was certainly my experience. And yet there were so many crucial aspects of recent history that shaped our country that I remained ignorant of, including the fact that, our space program, which became one of the sources of the largest sources of American national pride. We put a man on the moon and we beat the Soviets, et cetera. So much of our space program was driven by the fact that we went after World War II and handpicked the best, Nazi physicists and astrophysicists and brought them into NASA. And that was a major part of why we were able to make such advancements in space. I really do believe that one of the most important aspects of state propaganda and the ability of governments to feed people stories and mythologies that keep them in line is to make sure that information is concentrated in the hands of a very small group of people, all of whom are loyal to the same broader goal of having elite prerogatives maintained and strengthened. And this is why I do regard the internet far and away as the most revolutionary technological innovation in our lifetime, because that is what has threatened that ability more than anything. There really are no gatekeepers anymore. And so all of this, those facts about history and the way in which it kind of radically alters our understanding of what we've been taught to believe, of what the reality is of our societies, all of that has really corroded the foundation of trust in institutions. The more you're taught that actually you've been lied to repeatedly. I think the Iraq War was probably the kind of the spearhead of that, quickly followed by the 2008 financial crisis. This collapse in the faith in all of our institutions, and COVID did its role as well in finishing off what might have remained, is why power centers are now so obsessed with recommandeering the power of the internet and control over it. I mean, you see in the United States, this extreme example where TikTok was basically the only big social media app that could not be controlled by the US government. And that just couldn't be tolerated. And so they had to either threaten to shut down TikTok, even though tens of millions of young Americans were voluntarily choosing to use it, or more aptly, more preferably, force a sale of it into the hands of people who would promise to clamp down on dissent and reconvert TikTok into one of the most powerful tools of propaganda. And that's exactly what happened. Is you're seeing now the control of TikTok transferred not just into the hands of allies of the Trump administration, but particularly people whose lives are shaped by loyalty to the state of Israel. And these are all, the crackdowns on internet freedom, the concoction out of nowhere of this disinformation industry to justify political censorship, the increasing amounts of punishment to people expressing their views on the internet. This reflects this great fear that power centers have that the internet is finally fulfilling its potential to liberate and emancipate people. And this, to me, is the front line of the war over what kind of society we're going to have.
Do you think there was always a Machiavellian understanding around the internet? Because after all, it was DARPA and MIT or whatever, some or other unholy union that brought the beast into existence. You would think surely they must have known, or at least suspected, that by creating what they were creating, they would bring about the circumstances that they have, which is to say, so much information sharing by the hoi polloi and the great unwashed, so to speak. But do you think there was an understanding that they would have to put it out there to fish for us, to harvest the data, and then at the right time do what they're doing now, which is corral it, take control of it, and limit the use that the hoi polloi might put that monster to anymore?
Yeah, I think there's that dual aspect to almost every technology, especially major communication technologies. You see a lot of the same discourse around the advent of the radio and film and television in terms of the kind of threats that it might pose to power centers. And by and large, it had the opposite effect because they were controlled by the people who already wielded the greatest power, or the only people who could acquire power were ones who promise to remain loyal and have fidelity to the state and its various appendages. I think the internet, the unique feature of it is that it is far more diffuse and far more vulnerable to infiltration and subversion by people who don't have that same degree of loyalty. It's much more difficult to control, just the nature of it. But you're absolutely right to point out that from the beginning, these kind of conflicts were anticipated. I think the popular emergence of the internet as the internet, probably you can trace to the early to mid 1990s, when not just thousands or tens of thousands of people in universities or in DARPA, but just ordinary citizens began to be aware of the internet, its incipient expressions, and like AOL and CompuServe and all of that. And right away, of course, people in power understood that this could be very dangerous. It was all very anonymous. It was like the Wild West. Nothing that you did or said there could be traced, which is what made it so exciting. But you can go back to the 1990s and see Western governments, the Clinton administration, right away, especially in the wake of crises. There was that big attack on the Oklahoma City federal courthouse that was allegedly spearheaded by Timothy McVeigh. And immediately the Clinton administration exploited that to say we have this problem with domestic extremists, with right-wing anti-government radicals. And as a result, because this planning was done over the internet, we need to make sure that we have backdoor access to everything that happens on the internet so that we can spy on everything, so that we can understand it. And this right away became a major political conflict. And the Clinton administration wanted backdoor access to the encryption on which the internet technology was based then, and almost got it, but didn't, because there was the sense that, no, the internet is important precisely because it excludes the need to have corporate and state mediation in terms of how citizens communicate with one another. But that awareness, of course, was always there, in part because, as you said, the technology didn't appear in the private sector. It came from government agencies, especially defense and Pentagon researchers, looking for ways to make it a tool of militarism and corporatism. And this tension has been there from the very start. It's just that, I think it got a little bit out of control. This Frankenstein monster became very frightening to the people in power. I put the precipitating events as 2016, when the British people decided to leave the EU, even though they were instructed not to, very closely followed up by the shocking victory of Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton, the ultimate anti-establishment candidate versus the ultimate guardian of establishment status quo power, at least in terms of how it was perceived. That's what really instilled serious fear in Western power centers. And I think that's when you saw the intensification for real of the attempt to re-control the internet.
You mentioned a few minutes ago there Israel and the influence thereof. How do you assess at this moment in time the claim that Tucker Carlson made, and I saw you talking with him, that Benjamin Netanyahu is telling anyone and everyone that he tells Donald Trump what to do, makes no secret about it? How do you assess that?
Yeah, it's funny. Tucker said that in an interview on my show. I think it was Friday night or Thursday night. And when he said it, it didn't even make an impression on me, because, of course, that's true. There are clips of Netanyahu on tape in various contexts over 30 years, boasting of his ability to manipulate American public opinion to keep the American people captive to the interests of Israel. And they have had, I think a lot of people have forgotten that probably the last two presidents who really meaningfully challenged Israel in any way, and I don't mean they were opposed to Israel. They were certainly on the side of Israel. They viewed Israel as an ally, but they really viewed Israel as just like any other country that was allied with us, but also at times very contrary to our interests, was Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, both of whom in various ways challenged this idea that we always have to be captive to Israeli dictates. And what really put an end to it was when George H.W. Bush, and this is, the late 1980s, early 1990s, when he and his Secretary of State, James Baker, and National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, who are very much these realist kind of foreign policy operatives in the kind of species of, say, Professor John Mearsheimer and others who only care about U.S. national interests, when they started really threatening Israel, if you don't stop West Bank expansion, which jeopardizes a two-state solution, which is in our interest, we're going to cut off loan guarantees. You go back and look at what happened there, the bipartisan backlash, often even led by Democrats, in saying you are anti-Semite, you're attacking the Jewish state. When Bill Clinton ran for president in 1992 as a Democrat, and he was running against the incumbent president, George H.W. Bush, that was a major line of attack, which is, look, American Jews and voters and donors, the Republican administration is dumping Israel because they're anti-Semites, led by Jim Baker. And it destroyed Jim Baker's reputation. It proved to be a very successful electoral tactic. Bill Clinton won. And basically ever since then, American presidents have been afraid in any meaningful way to challenge Israel. Obama hated Netanyahu and had a couple of, sort of symbolic gestures. But by and large, he signed a $40 billion aid package on his way out to give Israel $4 billion a year for the next 10 years with Netanyahu. So this idea that Israel can get the United States to do whatever it wants, I mean, to anyone with a functioning set of eyes is something you already know. But Netanyahu boasting about it and his unique ability to understand the American mindset, to be able to manipulate it because of the years he spent living in the United States, this is something that has been around for a long time. So when Tucker said Netanyahu goes around boasting this, that to me was something it was kind of the table setting, the place setting for what he was going on to say. But it got so much attention because, I guess there are a lot of people new to the Israeli-U.S. relationship, younger people. It's kind of been on the back burner. And people are like, wait a minute, Netanyahu says that? And of course he says that. Of course that's how he thinks. And he thinks it because it's true. And that has been, I think, one of the most important things to happen is this refocus on the American-U.S. relationship by people who never thought about it before, not just to understand Israel and the United States, but as a window into understanding propaganda, how our government works, who owns and controls it, all of those things is kind of a proxy to a lot of other issues that are very destabilizing.
Do you think, though, that in terms of that relationship between the United States of America and Israel, that a Rubicon has been crossed? Because it's one thing for Israel to control a president or even an administration, even the inhabitants of Congress. But for the first time I ever remember, they seem to have lost control of the general rank and file of the American population, especially people under 30, under 25. I don't know in what way the demographics break down, but I've never seen that before, that the American people no longer seem to align with Israel in that traditional way.
Absolutely. And I mean, I live in Brazil and I see exactly the same thing. I mean, there's, the hardcore kind of evangelical Bolsonaro far right movement in Brazil that if you go to a protest of theirs, you'll see as many Israeli flags as you do Brazilian flags, because there's religious reasons and kind of a, national security, anti-Muslim ethos. But the country at large, the general population, has turned very aggressively against Israel in a way it never had previously. And this is replicating itself all over the world, including, as you said, in the United States. One of the most amazing statistical and polling changes is that young conservatives, and I don't mean just like 18 to 24, I mean, being generous and saying young conservatives, everybody under 50 who identifies as a conservative, a majority of them now hold negative views of Israel. And I think one of the reasons why you saw Charlie Kirk in the last couple of months of his life start to more openly deviate ever so slightly from what had been his steadfast pro-Israel posture was precisely because he represented a generation, young conservatives, who increasingly are turning against Israel and the idea that the United States should be faithful to it, should arm it, should finance it. So you're absolutely right that these changes are not trivial. They don't seem to be temporary. I don't see them being easily reversed. The only reason why I hesitate to kind of be triumphalist about this is because we've seen the ability in Western democracies to have populations believe in certain things with an overwhelming majority, and yet somehow have the political class unite to thwart their desire for it through all sorts of ways. You kind of distract them with cultural war issues that are very incendiary and pit one person against another. So now they're blaming each other or migrants or trans people for the problems of society, and not these much higher level questions that determine the disbursement of economic and political power. The elite class and the U.S.-Israel relationship and Israel's ability to get what it wants, these are not things that are going to fall easily simply because of a couple of years of polling. I can imagine getting rid of Netanyahu and pretending that Israel has now radically transformed because you have this new, whatever version of Netanyahu, maybe a woman, maybe someone who just has a different demographic profile, who just seems less, odious. If I could, I'll just give you one very quick example of how that works. In Europe, in 2006, 7, and 8, European population started really turning against the war in Afghanistan. And the United States needed European partners to help them in Afghanistan, especially once they decided to turn to Iraq. And a couple of countries had held elections, and the party that won was the party that promised to withdraw from Afghanistan. And the CIA wrote a memo. They were very worried about this eroding support for the war in Afghanistan in Europe. And they concluded in this top secret memo that was linked to WikiLeaks, one of the first that WikiLeaks actually got published, that the best solution for this would be for Barack Obama to win and become the American president, because he would then become the face of the war in Afghanistan rather than George W. Bush. And he has a face that's much more amenable to kind of the sensibilities of Western European liberals. And that's exactly what happened. He became the face of the war on terror. It was no longer George W. Bush, and diffused a lot of these oppositions. So there are a lot of different tactics still available to kind of undermine what is clearly, what you said is absolutely correct, the significant polling shift away from Israel.
I try as best I can to swim clear of the temptation all the time to play 3D chess, if not 4D chess and 5D chess with everything that's happening. But when you mentioned Charlie Kirk, and I fail to grasp or comprehend how it can be that already so quickly the official story that has come or is coming out from the centre around what happened to Charlie Kirk is more full of holes than a colander. And is it deliberately cack-handed so that people speculate in the way that everyone's speculating, or is it just the best that they cobbled together in the moment?
Yeah, I think it is important that when we talk about the effective tactics of Western power centers or elites or authoritarian institutions, whatever you want to use to describe them, that we not overlook the true power and efficacy of their tactics on the one hand, because they have proven their ability to remain in power. Propaganda is a science that has been very effective. So you want to acknowledge that on the one hand, but on the other, you don't want to assume or assign to them this extraordinary level of superhuman confidence that they simply don't have, because doing so might spread a kind of defeatism or fatalism that you don't want to encourage people to embrace, especially because it's simply untrue. And so as I think you're alluding to, the way in which this investigation was presented, the speed with which we were told it was resolved definitively, the kind of taboo that's trying to be imposed on any questioning of the official story, it does seem very amateurish. It doesn't seem particularly compelling at all. There's a lot of people who don't have the time to dig into these kinds of questions. They work, they don't work in politics, they don't, like us, have the full time to consume political news, to investigate, to interview people, to speak to people who have a lot of knowledge. So you can understand why the default position is to say, okay, they caught the guy, this is who the guy is, end of story. But for anybody who's been looking even a little bit more deeply into all of this, the doubts and the questions they're not hard to find. You don't have to do a lot of dot collecting. They're almost like intuitively obvious. And I do wonder, and this is, I think this is part of what that effort was, to create this impenetrable wall around any questioning of the Charlie Kirk narrative, people understanding that if they do, they can get fired, that you got hundreds of people being fired in the wake of this, not just for celebrating his death, but for speaking ill of him or in any way questioning the narrative. I think that was very much the plan, knowing how poor this story has been constructed. That has been constructed is to say, okay, we're going to create this kind of chilling effect, this fear, this culture of self-censorship, where nobody can question it without seeming to be malicious about it. And I wonder the extent to which that will work. I think it's very much up in the air.
But the official narrative around JFK really sustained for a lifetime. It's only now that it's become, popular chit chat that, clearly the official narrative was not the story. But it's the speed with which the narrative that was offered around Charlie Kirk just collapsed. Hours. To the extent that, my wife and I were joking that, one of our teenagers could have quite effectively cross-examined the FBI, with glaring questions that pointed out, the holes in the story through which you could have driven a juggernaut. It's the ineptitude seems so extreme that you think they must have meant us to see it. It's so bad.
Yeah, I mean, these are what I think are. This is why, even though I share a lot of your critiques fundamentally of kind of the, very odious direction in which our Western democracies are headed, that I also have a great deal of optimism, because this is a perfect example. You're talking JFK assassination, which, seems like a long time ago. If you look at it in one perspective, it's now, 65 years or 60 years or so. But on the other, the whole world has changed. And I would just point to two different significant ways in which these changes have taken place. There are many, but just to talk about two, which we've kind of alluded to. One is that in the 1960s, all information was concentrated in a tiny group of people and a very similar corporate interest. You had three major television networks. There was no even cable news. There were newspapers, but they were in the hands of families who had very similar interests and similar ideologies. And so all the information that people got about the JFK assassination was filtered through this tiny group of people. And then at the same time, you had a very high level of faith in government institutions. People trusted the FBI, they trusted the CIA, they trusted major American media outlets. So when they all united to present an official story about what happened with JFK, enough people believed it so that it didn't become a threat to the prevailing order. Now you look at how we get information, it's completely the opposite. Nobody pays attention to television networks anymore. I don't know anybody who, even our age, cares much about what television networks to say. My kids who are, teenagers, they don't even know what television is. They don't ever turn on a TV. It's completely irrelevant to them. I sometimes watch them looking at news sources that shock me in terms of how did they find these, alternative sources of news, not even necessarily ones I like, but ones that at least are dissident or alternative and encourage them to think critically. That's one big difference. But I think the biggest difference is, as we were talking about earlier, is the collapse of faith and trust. So even if authorities are giving a version of events that's compelling, even if there's a lot of evidence for it, the amount of doubt that will immediately arise simply by virtue of the fact that it's coming from them is automatically so great that doubts will proliferate in a way that I think is very healthy. Obviously, you can go too far and become too skeptical or jaded about authoritarian institutions and their version of events. Sometimes they do tell the truth, and assuming they're always lying is a little bit reactionary. But I far prefer excess skepticism to what we've had for decades, if not longer, which is far too little skepticism.
I mean, I'd have to say also in line with a conversation, maybe it was the same conversation that I saw you having with Tucker Carlson, between JFK and Charlie Kirk sits 9/11, a kilometre high. It's, and I mentioned the collapse of load-bearing myths. Now, if that official narrative, which seems shot through with inconsistency, were to collapse, there's JFK, there's Charlie Kirk, but 9/11 has at its heart 3,000 US citizens and then 1 million plus others' lives that were spent in consequence. What would be the consequence of any more successful questioning of that official narrative?
Yeah, and not just the wars and deaths, but also the radical transformation of our societies, the acquiescence to enormous amounts of concentrated state power in surveillance and detention and all sorts of other things that we accepted in the name of fighting against this threat based on the story that we were told. I've talked about this a couple of times, but I think one of the most extraordinary things that happened, and I, sometimes myself can't even comprehend the significance of it, let alone try and convey it to other people, is in late 2023 and early 2024 during, what had become the peak of the start of the Israeli destruction of Gaza. There were huge numbers of people. And I think as you get older, you forget this, but there's a huge generation that comes after you that has no idea of the things that you lived through. This is just this nature of human life. And so they didn't live through 9/11. They didn't live through, the debates afterwards. It's all kind of dead foreign history to them. And you had this massive amount of people in this new generation who discovered the letter that Osama bin Laden wrote to the American people, trying to explain to them the reasons why there's so much anti-American hatred and hostility to them in that part of the world, including the sentiment that perhaps or arguably gave rise to 9/11. And you had all these people reading it and their minds were kind of blown. Like, what? I never knew that Al-Qaeda was angry at us because we were bombing their regions and overthrowing their governments and installing dictatorships and supporting Israel. I was always told that this was just a radical group of religious fanatics who hated the fact that we voted and had women in bikinis on the beach. And you could watch their minds being blown in real time by discovering this thing that had been hidden from them. I don't just mean the letter, but the whole, debate and narrative that had never entered their consciousness because it was excluded. And overnight, as especially on TikTok, this discussion proliferated about this obviously historical important document, no matter what you think about it, the US government and a bunch of other interests put immense pressure on TikTok to simply ban any discussion of the Osama bin Laden letter. People couldn't find it anymore. And it just got blocked. Like, it just evaporated from the amount of information that people could access. And that, to me, going to that level of an extreme behavior, so out in the open, so transparent, illustrates the panic that is induced anytime people start revisiting the question of 9/11. And of course, for so long, like with the JFK assassination, anybody who didn't accept the official story instantly was relegated to the fringes, if not completely silenced, as a crackpot, as a weirdo, as a unhinged conspiracy theorist. And that's the kind of thing you can do when people believe in institutions. But once they don't, they're at least as open, if not more so, to people telling them that the official story is false than the people who insist on everybody believing in it. And I think you're seeing this radical sea change in how that might be revisited.
I tend on for me, an uncharacteristically optimistic note. I would have to say that against all expectations, the announcement about digital ID in Britain, and obviously the backlash that there has been already about it, has actually been like a light coming on, a ray of light. I feel that this was the mistake that's going to really register. And I say that it's often said that it's not hard to tell the difference between a Scotsman with a grudge and a ray of sunshine. I tend towards the dark interpretation. But as soon as Keir Starmer made his announcement about digital ID, it became official. I felt a weight lift. I thought, now that is one step too far. And now we've got a party. Yeah,
I mean, when I see things like that, that also spurs a lot of optimism in me. One of the things that I've tried to do, and I lost a lot of, I don't know, let's say support or faith or whatever in a large part of, not a large part, but in a good chunk of the left with which I had always been most associated, was when I began to see, especially with the rise of Trump, this very intense anti-establishment politics on both the left and the right for the first time, that to me finally gave some hope to escape this kind of, binary pro-establishment choice where you say within the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, you have minor shifts, but basically they're both designed to preserve establishment authority. I saw this populist uprising on the right and the left, the sort of Bernie Sanders, and you see it in France with Mélenchon and others, but then also this populist right that sometimes, for all their dangers, did converge with this anti-establishment ethos on the left. And the fact that it's not just the left, but you have obviously Nigel Farage against this national identity card and a huge number of people in the middle. That to me shows the weakening of these establishment parties. And with any kind of change, there's a potential for good and a potential for something worse to happen. But once the status quo becomes so untenable, you kind of have to roll the dice. And the fact that something even 10 years ago that would have been presented as just a security measure to keep you safe, to protect you, has now been interpreted as a huge threat shows that the real enemy in the eyes of so many people are not these foreign threats we're told to be very afraid of, whether terrorist groups or migrants or whatever, but instead, oftentimes the people exerting power within our own country, within our own society, who keep telling us they have our interest in mind, but increasingly people are realizing that that's a lie. And I think that's what's spurring this reaction.
Glenn Greenwald, I said at the beginning that your buoyancy is what helps to keep me afloat. And once again, it's been a real pleasure to spend some time with you and to hear your insights. Glenn Greenwald, thank you for your time.
Always enjoy talking to you. Happy to come back anytime.
Thanks for joining me on GB News Originals. If you've enjoyed this content, don't forget to click and subscribe. And if you haven't done so already, go to the App Store and download the GB News app.